in a country where a lot of people have given up hope that people really do come to become Christians, that conversion can really happen, she's someone that delights in making that invitation to people, delights in equipping others to make that invitation to people, and she's seen thousands of people come to believe in Jesus through her ministry here. So it's a real privilege to hear her come and speak on personal evidence.
It is a tremendous privilege to be here with you today. I flew over 2 days ago from the States where we were celebrating Christmas with our children. So here I am 2 days later. It is amazing. The Bible calls it good news. Another synonym for good news is the joy news. The good news, the joy news, is the most wonderful message that has ever graced our planet. The question is, how do we reach contemporary people with the truth and the beauty and the power of the gospel? That's what we're talking about today. Now, we have just heard Vince talk about how do we use the scientific argument from cosmology and design. How can that help us as we talk about the gospel? Later you're going to hear others speak about the gift of reason, the moral and the philosophical arguments. I have been asked to speak about the personal argument for faith. In other words, matters of the heart. But in order to do that, in order to talk about how can we talk about the reality of the person, the reality of our hearts, and how it connects to the gospel. In order to do that, we need to ask some prior questions. The first is, what does the Bible reveal about God? Secondly, what does the Bible reveal about human nature? And then thirdly, how does that knowledge impact the way that we speak to people using the personal argument? So let's do the first. Who is God? In Genesis 1 and 2, we learn that God is a creator, a sustainer of life. He is sovereign. He is all-powerful. He's holy and loving. The picture you get right from the beginning, this is not a stoic, unfeeling, cold, distant God. He is emotionally, intimately connected and involved. I think one of the most fascinating descriptions of God, even from the beginning in Genesis, God is described and revealed as a person. Now, of course, the ultimate revelation of God as person came through Jesus Christ coming to live, die, and resurrect. But even in Genesis 1 and 2, what we see is this God is a communicative God who speaks because he wants to be known. He uses words because he wants to connect. God is not a force. He's not an energy field. He delights in revealing who he is because he wants relationship with his creation. So to relate to God is not to relate to a power, but to a person. And the Bible expresses this aliveness of God by calling him the living God. Now, when the Hebrew writers use that term, living, for the Hebrew writers and thinkers, when they spoke of living, they were not interested in whether God merely existed. That was a Greek idea. The Greek thinkers and writers were very curious about whether God existed. But for the Hebrew writers, life meant something active and dynamic. Does God's presence make a difference from Tuesday to Wednesday? Is he the transcendental interferer? Is God alive? And the resounding biblical claim is that God is alive. He is a God to be reckoned with. You can love him, you can hate him. You can reject him, you can fall on your knees and worship him, but above all, you can know him. He is the living God. God is a person, and he will help us in seemingly impossible situations. He will help us when we are afraid. He will strengthen us in our weakness. He will go before us share our faith because God stands with the faithful. Now, sharing the good news is not motivated because it's our idea. We share the good news. We learn these apologetic skills because we are called by God to share his message. You know, right before Jesus ascended into heaven, you remember what he said? What he said was, "Go ye therefore and make disciples of all the nations." You would almost think, based on how he acts, you would almost think that Jesus' last words before he went to heaven was more like this: "Go ye therefore," okay, all ye extroverts, all of you with dynamic relational skills, and all ye Baptists, go and make disciples. And the rest of you, hang out, sing some hymns, I'll be back before you know it. No, we go because we are commanded by God, who is alive, who is a person, who loves his creation, and who longs for all people to know him. God is a person. What do we learn about human nature from the Bible? Genesis 1 tells us we have been created in the very image of God. Now, what else does Genesis, it's just Genesis, but the entire Bible, what does it reveal about the nature of God? I think this is one of the most remarkable revelations in all of Scripture. What does the Bible reveal? At the center of the universe is a relationship. At the center of the universe is a community. And it is out of that divine community that you and I were created and redeemed. It is for that relationship that we discover who we are and why we are here. Because at the center of all reality is a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God is a relational being. Three persons in one, in union, who share each other's life and love in perfect love, and we are made in his image. Now, what does that mean? It means if we are created in the image of God, we have been created for profound love relationship. To God first, to our neighbor, and to ourselves. It is knowing God that makes us human. To be fully human is to know Jesus Christ, who leads us to the Father. And no matter how well we clean up, no matter how good we look on the outside, without a relationship with God, there will always be an inner emptiness that we are trying to cover. Now, you don't say that to people. You don't say to people, "Oh, you know what, you think you're great, you're such a mess." That would not be my suggestion. But it makes a difference when we realize what it means to be fully human. That we are to know our Creator through faith in Jesus Christ. So we no longer see people from a human point of view, but from Christ's point of view. We realize that what we see is not what we get. We need to take a deeper look. Okay, God is person, among many other things. We have been created human beings. We are persons who have been created to know our Creator. How does this knowledge then impact how we speak to people about the gospel, particularly in relationship to the heart, to personal evidence? What does it mean? And particularly, how do we help people understand that their very human need, their dreams, their longings, how do we help them see that it is intimately connected to the gospel? That indeed the gospel is the answer to the human need, to the human dream, to the longing to be fulfilled. How do we do it? How do we go from their humanity and connect it to the gospel? There are three ways. First of all, we need to listen to their story. Secondly, we need to tell God's story. And thirdly, we need to share our story. What do I mean that we need to listen to their story? I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in evangelism is we tend to jump in and start speaking rather than asking questions first. We need to ask questions, seek to discover what are their passions, what are their dreams, what are their needs, and find out the question behind the question. You're talking to somebody who goes, how could there be a good God with so much suffering? Is this merely an academic question for them? And then you begin to sense there's a lot of energy around that question. So you say, can I just ask you something? You seem to have a lot of energy when you're asking about how could a good God allow evil. Can I ask you, why is that question so important to you? Yeah, I'll tell you why. My mother died at 10. What kind of God would allow that? Now we know something else. It isn't just an intellectual question. This is a heart question. This is a wound. And how we approach that person has to recognize that as well. We listen to their story, and Jesus is such a good example of this. You look at Jesus. Never did he treat people like evangelistic projects. People can smell that a mile away. If you're just looking at them as an evangelistic project, they'll know it. No, Jesus was involved. He got involved authentically. He listened. He loved. What are the two ways we see Jesus approaching people? He was radically identified and yet radically different. So in this area of listening to their story, what we don't do is feign interest, pretend we're interested, because really all we want to do is slip in the gospel. That is not Jesus' style. We listen, we love with the love of Christ, and we don't impose the gospel, we expose the gospel. But we expose it not as a manipulative trick. We do it in response to their genuine needs. Listen to their story. Secondly, we share, we tell God's story. Now, what you need to do is you need to ask yourself, how does the gospel answer what they're looking for? Also ask yourself, is there a biblical story that relates to what they are sharing with me? Let me tell you something. I have already said God is alive. He's a living God. The Bible is also alive. And we need to use the living word the right way and the right time. We need to invite seekers to say, you know what, let's take a look. Would you be willing to look? Let's just give it a go. Let's go one time and see. You don't have to believe in the Bible. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe in anything. But let's take a look and see what it says. Now, how do we then, if we are, the third thing we do at the appropriate time, we share our story. Because we are not speaking to them from on high, as if we have no connection. Rather, their problems are our problems. Their issues are our issues. We're not preaching down. We're side by side sharing. As D.T. Nichols says, one beggar sharing with another beggar where he found bread. Listen to their story, tell God's story, share your story. Now, how do we do this? I want to give you two examples of how we can learn how to take their need and connect it with gospel truth. Several years ago, my children were probably about 10 and 12, and for Christmas, they gave me a Christmas gift. They saved up their allowance, and they were so excited because they got me a half day at a spa, and they were thrilled with this. So I went to the spa place. Now, gentlemen, I realize the example I'm about to give is very female, but trust me, there is eternal truth to be gained. So it turns out it was a manicure and getting my hair done. So I go in, I sit down, I'm right in front, obviously, of this woman. Her name is Jill. And one of the things that Jesus does is he asks a lot of questions. And I said, well, Jill, can you tell me, what's the most exciting thing that's happened to you in the last year? Oh, she said, that's easy. She said, I'm sinful and I became a homeowner. And she said, so that's just been a dream come true. I said, did you have a housewarming party? She said, oh, I did. We just had it. And I didn't even know why I asked this. I said, did everybody come that you were hoping? She said, well, everybody but my mother. Of course, my mother would come. Now, often, people will tell strangers what they wouldn't tell friends. And so, I began to pray, because I didn't want to cry, and asked the Lord to help me. But I said, well, Jill, do you mind telling me a little bit more? Why wouldn't your mother want to come to something so wonderful? She said, Becky, my mother thinks that everything good that ever happened to me should have happened to her. That somehow it was at her expense, anything good that happened to me. I said, Jill, I am so sorry. She began telling me story after story. And I finally said, Jill, do you know what I think the problem is? I think your mother's envious. She said, oh, I can't believe you said that. I said, what? She said, I just figured that out yesterday. Now, that was a clue to me. God was already at work. And she goes, I figured that out yesterday. She goes, so we started talking about envy, the nature of envy. Now, I had written a book called A Heart for God. It was based on the life of David before he became king. Had quite a few chapters on King Saul and David. So we're talking about envy, and she goes, Becky, you sound like you know a lot about envy. How do you know so much about envy? Now, I usually don't tell people that I have written books initially if they find it a little intimidating. So I said, I did a writing project. And in that writing project, I used David in the Bible. She said, well, I went to church when I was a little girl. That's the guy that killed Goliath, right? And I said, right. And she goes, well, I didn't know David had a problem with envy. I said, oh, it wasn't David, it was King Saul. I said, King Saul was ultimately destroyed by his envy. Should have been a father figure to David. He was eaten up with envy. In fact, Jill, the more you've described your mother, the more I realize she had the perfect personality profile of King Saul. And she said, there is someone in the Bible like my mother. She said, okay, tell me more. Now, of course, why did I begin to tell that story? Because it's her story. And so as I talked about, she had all these questions. How did David handle this? How did he handle that? Finally, she said, was he able to forgive him? Now, remember what she's doing. She's finally my name. Except it was like this. I didn't have any nails left. Because it was her story. And she said, did he forgive? I said, yes, he did. But he couldn't have done it without the help of God. And she goes, well, it must have been easier to forgive in biblical times. And I knew I was losing her. And so, I had listened to her story. I shared God's story. Now it was time to tell my story. I said, Jill, I really identify with your difficulty in forgiving. I said, there is someone in my life who has done enormous harm to people I love deeply. Told her the whole story, and I said, there was nothing in me that wanted to forgive this person, that even had the power to forgive. But I hated carrying the poison inside me. And I said, now there's something about me you don't know. I'm a Christian. And I said, Jesus Christ. Yeah, I follow Jesus Christ. And I said, it is only because of God's presence in my life that I was able to do something that was so hard. Then she looks at me and she asks the question of all questions. Becky, how do you forgive the unforgivable? At that moment, a bell rang. A woman comes. She kind of lifts me up out of the chair and said, thank you, Jill, and takes me on down for my hair. And that was her. So I walk into the house, and my kids looked at me. I walked in, and they went, Mom, you look great. I said, I've got to go back for the sake of the gospel. Yeah, right. I said, no, I do. I went back a couple of weeks later. You know when Jesus talks about sheep without a shepherd? When I walked in and sat at her table, she said, I can't believe you've come back. She said, Becky, I went out, I bought a Bible that night, and I called my brothers and said, there's someone in the Bible like Mom. But I didn't know where to go. I couldn't remember what to read. And that began the beginning of a real relationship with her. Because I listened to her story, and then I connected it to his story. I shared my story. And out of that, I was free to share the gospel of Jesus. How else do we communicate the good news using this model? What about somebody very, very different than Jill? How about the person who is arrogant, says there is no truth, there is no evidence to substantiate truth or the claims of Christianity? How do we deal with that person using this model? When I finished graduate work, I did undergraduate and graduate work in English literature, and I was asked by what would be the equivalent of UCCF in America. It's called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. I was asked to join them on staff at one of the most academic universities in America called Reed College. And it was absolutely fabulous experience. My very first year, I did it for 5 years. My very first year, I am flying home. It was in Portland, Oregon. I'm flying home to Chicago. I raised south of Chicago. And I sit down next to a man. You tell me what you think he did for a living. He had a tweed jacket. He spoke in a very pedantic way. He had a pipe in his pocket and glasses that were Coke bottle thick. And of course, he was a professor. And he was a professor at one of our really good universities. And we talked about everything. The conversation just went so well. But I knew, because Americans tend to ask this faster than you would do in the UK, he said, by the way, Becky, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm in Christian work. And he said, that's impossible. I said, what? He said, you look normal. He said, and you seem so intelligent. Everything changed. You could see he had thought I was normal. Now I'm abnormal. He's trying to figure out how to speak to me. And he goes, well, what's the name of your little organization? And I said, InterVarsity. Now, I don't know if you know this, but varsity has quite an athletic connotation in America. Varsity sports, varsity sweaters, etc. He said, I work with InterVarsity. And then he looked at me really strangely. He says, excuse me for saying this, but you don't look like a Christian athlete. I thought he was joking, so I said, yes, well, I play basketball for Jesus. Are you ready for this? He believed me. And he said, well, I'm sure playing basketball for Jesus must be very rewarding. Now, I was so tempted to play along with his stereotype. I was so tempted to say, oh, playing basketball for Jesus is such a blessing. We never lose a game. But I said, no, actually, that was a joke. Sometimes we make jokes. I said, you know what? I don't find it rewarding. I would say it's unbelievably intriguing. He said, intriguing. All right. Why is it intriguing? Why did I do this? Because Jesus calls us to be fishers of men, not hunters of men. And we need to throw out bait. One of the ways we throw out bait, one of the ways that we arouse curiosity is using provocative language. But here is another thing. What is that person's greatest point of resistance to Christianity? Ask yourself that question and then you mention it before they do. He said, why is it so intriguing? I said, I work with extremely bright students, and every day, as Christians, they ask themselves, how do we know it's true? How do we know we're not labeling our own little world and calling it reality? How do we know it's true? He said, Becky, that is exactly my issue. How do you know it's true? I want to hear. Now, this man was in the story. He was a history professor at the University of Chicago, so I began talking about historical apologetics, which you're going to hear about later today. When I finished talking about all the different evidences of why is Christianity credible from a historical point of view, he said to me, I need to tell you a couple of things. He said, what you don't know about me is that I was raised in a Christian home. He said, but I realized, as we've been speaking, I began to believe that it wasn't possible to be a thinking person and a Christian. The more we speak, the more I realized that that assumption was fallacious. He said, and what I realized as we speak is that I blindly accepted faith as a child, but I have blindly rejected it as an adult. And for the sake of intellectual integrity, I need to know what it is I've rejected and why. So I'm going to go home, I'm going to buy a Bible, and the next time we meet each other, I'll be able to prove to you why it isn't true. Do you know how many people have bought a Bible and read it in order to prove it isn't true and been radically converted? I'm one of them. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I was an agnostic for a long time. But then he said to me, Becky, what strikes me the most about you is you seem to be a woman of hope and not despair. And Becky, despair is all I feel. Why do you have hope? And at that point, he was asking me to share the reason for my faith. And so I shared the gospel of Jesus Christ. My friends, God is alive. We have been created to know him, and we have been commanded to listen to where people are, to connect where they are with the gospel, and to share our story as well. The wonderful news and what motivates us is God wants to set us free. He wants us to be fully human. As one of the church fathers, Irenaeus, said, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. Now maybe you were like me, not coming from a Christian home. Maybe you feel, I'd like to give my life to Christ, but I can't imagine what a religious version of me would look like. Would I even recognize myself? What would my friends say about me? What I want to say to you is that while Jesus radically transforms us, he leaves us more ourselves than we ever dreamed possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky. I have some gifts in the form of questions for you. Here's the first one. That's a big statement. To be fully human is to know Jesus Christ. What do you mean by that? And would you say that non-Christians are therefore not fully human?
What does it mean to be fully human? We have been created to know God. We have been created to be filled with God. And we need a way to be able to overcome what is wrong so that we become more truly ourselves. And so that is why we need to help people take a look at not only what's wrong, but how can God make me more fully human? Now, one of my suggestions, so the other question is, would I say to people, you're not fully human? I don't know that I would say it, but I would show it. One of the things I would encourage you to do is to say, listen to their need, listen to where they're struggling, and then look at what passage might relate to them. The whole idea of salvation means to become whole. And the biblical picture of becoming whole is many faceted. So if you're talking to somebody that is saying, you know what, I feel so alienated, so cut off, then you might say, one of the things that Jesus wants is for us to come home. We are to come home to God.